Yeah, we are back again. This is chapter 9, the transport system in animal, and this part 2 of that chapter, so the circulatory system, or what you call the transport system in animal. This is part 2 of the chapter. Now, without much ado, let's take a look at what we have. Now, first of all, what we have today is identify the structure in the heart. You know, for IGCSE students, for extended students, we're going to look at it. Identifying the structure of the heart. We want to live with every part, every singular part of the heart, and we'll be able to live with them and state their function individually. Now, first of all, let's talk about that. You know, the heart is made up of 4 chambers. We have the ventricles, the left ventricle and the right ventricles, and then we have the left atriums and the right atriums. So these alone, they form different parts of the heart. And then we'll go to look at every other part, like the different arteries, the capillaries, the veins, the vena cava, the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein, all of this, the valve, the semilunar valve, the biscupic valve, and triscupic valves. All of this, we're going to look at them, where each of these valves are, what is their functions, what do they do. So we're going to look at all of this today. Now, let's take a look. Well, let's start from the ventricle. The ventricles, they have thicker muscle walls than the arteries. Why is that so? They have the ventricles, they have the thicker muscle wall than the atria. You know, ventricle and atrium. Atrium is the singular, atria is the plural. Okay, these are the two main names that form the chambers of the heart. Okay, so we have we say the ventricles, they have the thicker muscle wall than the atria, and they are for pumping blood out of the heart. The ventricles, that's where the blood goes out of the heart. Okay, the atria, that's where the blood goes into the heart. The atria, that's where the blood goes. The blood coming from the vein goes into the heart through the atria. But the blood that is being pumped out of the heart, it's going to be pumped out of the ventricle. So we're going to take a look at this. You know, we have the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Okay. So that's the first introductory message, that because the blood is being pumped from the ventricle, they need to be able to withstand high blood pressure, because the blood is being pumped out of the ventricle to the outer, the biggest artery that takes the blood from the left ventricle to the outer, which is the biggest arteries that takes the blood away from the heart. But between there are a lot of valves. There is a valve called the semilunar valves that separates the atrium, that separates the part of the ventricle on the heart to the atrium. There is a valve that connects the ventricle to the outer, the biggest artery that takes the blood away from the heart. We're going to talk about all of these things. Now let's start with the left ventricle. The left ventricle has a thicker muscle wall than the right ventricle. The left one has a thicker muscle wall than the right ventricle. Why? Because the left ventricle is where the blood is being pumped away, to the rest of our body. The left ventricle is where the blood is being pumped away to the rest of our body. The right ventricle only pumps the blood to the lungs. The right ventricle pumps blood only to the lungs to go and give the deoxygenated blood to the lungs and bring back oxygenated blood to the heart again. So the walls of the left ventricles needs to be thicker so to withstand what is going to the rest of the body, because it needs a very high blood pressure. The heart is pumping boom boom to the rest of the body, so it needs to be able to be, the walls of the ventricle needs to be thick, or needs to be thicker than that of the left ventricle, needs to be thicker than that of the right ventricle, because it's from the left ventricle that the blood is being pumped to the rest of the body. Here is the left ventricle, okay? Schematically, this is the left ventricle. So this place, the walls of this ventricle needs to be thicker, needs to be super thicker than that of the right one, because from the right one, the blood is being pumped. From the right ventricle, the blood is pumped to the lungs only. So the walls of this one is not as thick as the walls of the left ventricle, because the left ventricle is where the blood is pumped to join the aorta, which is the biggest artery that takes the blood to the rest of the body. Is that okay? So that's the reason, because the left ventricle, its responsible is to help to pump the blood at a very high pressure to the entire body. The reason why the walls of the left ventricle needs to be thicker than the right ventricle is that the left ventricle is responsible for pumping the blood to the rest of the body, to the entire human body. So the left ventricle needs to pump blood at a very high pressure, because if not at high pressure, the blood will not be able to move. So it needs to pump blood at a very high pressure to the rest of the body. So the walls of the left ventricle needs automatically to be thicker than that of the right ventricle, because the right ventricle only pumps blood to the lungs, for gaseous exchange and bring the oxygenated blood back to the heart. So you can see it's just like a singular function. But in the case of the left ventricle has to pump blood to the rest of the body cells, to the rest of our body. So the walls needs to be thicker. So I guess that is understood. Now let's move on to the other part. Okay, we say the right one just only need to pump blood at lower pressure to the lungs. The right ventricle only needs to pump blood at lower pressure, not at high pressure, because it's only the reason why it can't be low pressure, because it's sending blood only to the lungs. So it doesn't need to be high pressure, and it's sending it through the pulmonary artery. It's sending it through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. It's sending the blood through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. There's a valve called the semilunar valve also that connects the blood from the ventricle to the pulmonary artery. While for the left ventricle, there's a valve that connects from the left ventricle to what we call the aorta, the biggest artery that takes the blood to the rest of the body cells, that takes the oxygenated blood to the rest of the body cells. Is that okay? Okay, so that's that for that. Then there's also a part of the heart that we call the septum. The septum separates the two sides of the heart and so prevent the mixing of oxygenated blood from the deoxygenated blood. The septum is this empty space. You see, this empty space runs along. Okay, it runs from this top to bottom. So it runs along. It's called the septum. It separates the left side of the heart from the right side. This is the left side of the heart, and this is the right side of the heart. So that separates the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart is called the septum. So septum separates the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart. Okay? Please take note, because these are in your exam paper in biology. Okay? So the septum separates the left side of the heart. This whole, what color is this? What will you call this color? Peach. This a peach color. Okay, so this peach color represents the septum, which separates the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart. Is that okay? So now let's take a look at what next we have. Let's take a look at, we've talked about the left atrium. Okay, this is the left atrium. It's just above the ventricle. The atrium is just above the ventricle. This is the left atrium. The blood from the lungs comes through this place. The oxygenated blood from the lungs comes through the left atrium to the left ventricle. The oxygenated blood from the lungs comes in to the heart through the left atrium and then flow down to the left ventricle. And then that same oxygenated blood is being pumped from the left ventricle to the biggest aorta, to the biggest artery called the aorta that connects the blood to the rest of the body cells. Is that okay? Okay. So, however, we say the right ventricle pumps the blood. The right ventricle pumps the blood to the blood. First of all, the blood from the vena cava coming from the rest of the body that carry the deoxygenated blood which carry carbon dioxide, comes into this into the right atrium. So from the right atrium, the blood flows into the right ventricle. It flows into the right ventricle. Then from here, the blood is pumped at lower pressure to the lungs, and it goes to the lung through the pulmonary artery. It goes to the lungs through what? The pulmonary artery. But before it joins the pulmonary artery, there is a valve called the semilunar valves. Both the semilunar valve is found from the left ventricle to the pulmonary artery, and it's also found from the right from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, and it's also found from the left ventricle to the aorta. So the valves is in both cases. Look at it. The valves is here in the left ventricle, joining the blood from the left ventricle to the aorta. The biggest artery takes the blood to the rest of the body, and this semilunar valve is also found in the right ventricle, connecting the right ventricle to the pulmonary arteries that is taking the blood to the lungs, that is taking the deoxygenated blood to the lungs, for gaseous exchange. Now, when that blood gets to the lung, the carbon dioxide diffuses out from the red blood cells into the alveoli of the lungs, and then oxygen diffuses to replace the carbon dioxide from the alveoli. It diffuses into the red blood cells, and then with the presence of hemoglobin, it becomes a color red, and it brings the blood back to the heart through the left atrium. It brings the oxygenated blood back to the heart through this place, this channel, the right atrium. So from the right atrium, the blood flows down to the left, and from the left atrium, the blood flows down to the left ventricle. In the left ventricle, the walls of the left ventricle are thick enough to withstand the high blood pumping, the high blood pressure, and the high blood pumping of the heart. So this heart, the left ventricle pumps it at very high pressure, pumps the blood at very high pressure, and the valves open. When the blood is coming at high pressure, this semilunar valves opens up so that the blood from the left ventricle can join the aorta, the biggest artery that takes the blood to the rest of the body. However, there is a valve here. There's a valve we've not talked about, the biscopic valve. Now, when the blood is coming from the lungs and it joins the left atrium, between the left atrium and the left ventricle, there is a valve called the biscopic valve. This valve is here, is at this corner. It's called the biscopic valve. It's also known as the mitral valve. Okay? There's a valve here that opens when the blood is coming from the left atrium, from the lungs, the oxygenated blood that is coming from the lungs. When it gets to the left atrium, before it joins the left ventricle, this valve has to open, the biscopic valve has to open for the blood to flow into the left ventricle. And then the valve closes. Then from here, when there's blood is being pumped at high pressure, there's no way the blood can go back to the left atrium. There's no way the blood can flow back to the left atrium because the valve is closed. The blood can only flow through this place to join the aorta and through the semilunar valve. This semilunar valve has to open for the blood to join the aorta and flow to the rest of the body at high pressure. Also, from vena cava, the blood that is coming from the rest of the body is through the vein, and this biggest vein is called the vena cava. Now, these veins, when it's entering, it enters through the right atrium. It enters through the right atrium. Then after that, there's a valve connected to the right atrium to the right ventricle. And that valve is called tricuspid valve. That valve that connects, is the difference in their name. This is biscopic, this is tricuspid. Okay? The valve connecting the right atrium to the right ventricle is called the tricuspid valve. These valves, when it opens, then this deoxygenated blood flows into the right ventricle. So when it's in the right ventricle, then the blood is pumped. This valve closes. The tricuspid valve closes. Then the blood is pumped to flow through this semilunar valve that will open so that the blood can flow through the pulmonary artery. This is a pulmonary artery to the lungs for gaseous exchange to pick up oxygen. Is that okay? So these are the parts that you need to know. Now, these are the walls of the left ventricle, and it's much thicker. These walls of the left ventricle is much thicker than the walls of the right ventricle. These walls on the left ventricle, the walls around the left ventricles are much thicker than the walls around the right ventricle. You can see the spacing between the ventricle, the left ventricle, and the heart, the end of the heart. You can see is wider. So the walls are thicker. The walls around the left ventricles are thicker in order to also withstand the high blood pumping. Compare the walls. Look at the walls here around the right ventricle. They're thin. The walls are very thin. They're not so thick. The walls around here are thin. They're not so thick. Reason is that here the pump is at lower pressure, but here the pump is at high pressure. So the walls around the ventricle needs to be thicker. The left ventricle needs to be thicker in order to withstand the high blood pumping. In order to withstand the high blood pumping. Is that okay? So these are the parts of the heart that you need to know. Now let's take a look at the functions of the valves. Let's take a look at the functions of the valve. We say the basic functions of the valve is to prevent the blood from flowing backwards. That's the basic function of the valve. The reason why God Almighty put valves in our heart is to prevent the blood from flowing backward. Just like in a diode, in an electrical circuit. Diode allow current to flow in only one direction. So it doesn't allow it to have a reverse flow. So the valves are like diode in case of electrical circuitry. Okay? So what the valves do is the basic function is to prevent the blood from flowing backward. So any blood that has passed the valve cannot go back. Any blood that has flowed past the valves cannot flow backwards. That's the basic functionality. Why the creator of human being, the Almighty God, put valves in the heart. Now, there are also other two sets of valves in the heart. There are two sets of valves. Let's take a look at these two sets of valves, okay, that are found in the heart. One is the atrioventricular valves, the valves responsible for connecting atrium and ventricle. They are called the atrioventricular valves. They separate the atria from the ventricles. The atrioventricular valves. Atrioventricular valves. From the name, you can tell what is the functionality. Atra is the plural of atrium. Atra is the plural of atrium. So atrioventricular. You can see the name ventricular. So it's from ventricle. So it means the valve that separates the atria, the plural of atrium. Okay? When I say atra, I'm actually talking about atrium, but I'm talking in terms of the plural. I'm talking in terms of both. I'm talking in terms of both of them. So when we say the atrioventricular valves, they separate the atria from the ventricles. They are the valves that separate the atria, or the singular, which is the atrium, from the ventricles. Okay? That's atrioventricular valves. That's one valve that we have in the heart. Okay, the valve on the right side of the heart is called the tricuspid valve. Okay, the tricuspid valve. And the valve on the left side is called the bicuspid valve. Both of them, they separate the ventricles. The one on the left separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve is the valve on the left, which separates on the left side of the heart. Okay, I already differentiated between the left side of the heart and the right side. It's not your whole right. Your whole right is the left of the heart, and your whole left is the right of the heart. Is that okay? Okay, we've already explained this in part 1 of this section. So we say the bicuspid valve separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve. They are actually atrioventricular valves. And then the tricuspid valves separates the right atrium from the right ventricles. They separate the right atriums from the right ventricles. The tricuspid valve separates the right atriums from the right ventricles. So you need to know these two valves. They are both called the atrioventricular valves. Both of them are called atrioventricular valves. Both of them are called atrioventricular valves. Okay? Now, These valves are pushed open when the atria contracts. When they are pushed open when the atria contracts. These valves, they pushed open when the atria, they contract. Because the walls of the atria will contract so that the blood can go. So when they contract, these valves are pushed open. Right? These valves, we say they're pushed open when the atria, both the left atrium and the right atrium. When they contract, then these valves are pushed open. But when the ventricles contract, they are pushed shut. They close. When the ventricle contract, then they close. When the ventricle contract, they close. They have to close so that the blood cannot flow backward. When the ventricle contract, they have to close so that the blood cannot flow backward. Because when the atria contract, they open. This right atrium, when it contracts, then this valve will open. This tricuspid valve will open. So the blood can flow from this right atrium to this right ventricle. Similarly, the oxygenated blood that is coming from the lungs, when this atrium contracts, this valve, this bicuspid valve here will open. When it opens, the blood can flow in. And then when this left ventricle now contract, this valve will close so that the blood cannot go backward. The valve will close. When the ventricle contracts, this bicuspid valve here, which are called the atrioventricular valves, both of them are both called atrioventricular valves. This valve, the bicuspid valve, will close when this ventricle contracts. It will close. So the blood can go only in this direction, not this backward where it's coming from. You know, the oxygenated blood coming from the lungs enters through the left atrium. Now, when it gets there, this atrium will contract. When the left atrium contracts, this oxygenated blood flows into this left ventricle. It flows into this left ventricle. Now, when the left ventricle again contracts, this bicuspid valve will close. It only open when the atrium contracts. This atrium contracts, this bicuspid valve will open, the blood can flow here. But when this left ventricle now contracts, this bicuspid valve will close. So that the blood can only this direction to go. The blood can only flow this way. Cannot flow this way anymore. Can only flow this way. The blood flows this way and go to the rest of the body. Now from the from the rest of the body, the deoxygenated blood enters through the right atrium. Then this right atrium will contract. This right atrium will contract. When it contracts, this tricuspid valve will open. When the right atrium contracts, this tricuspid valve will open. And then the blood can flow into the right ventricle. Now, when the right ventricle contracts, this tricuspid valve will close. When this one now contracts the right ventricle, this tricuspid valve will close. Then you know, this tricuspid and bicuspid, they are both called atrioventricular valves. They are both called atrioventricular valves. Okay, so when this right ventricle now contracts, this tricuspid valve will close. This tricuspid valve will close, and the blood can now go through this way to join the pulmonary artery. To join the pulmonary artery, this semilunar valve has to open for it. Okay, this is the second valves that we found in the heart. Apart from the atrioventricular valves, there's also semilunar valves that are found in the heart, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so we talked about the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. They are called the atrioventricular valves that are both found connecting the atriums or the atria to the ventricles. That's one types of valves that are found in the heart. Now, the second types of the valves that are found in the heart are called the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are found in the two blood arteries. They are found in the two blood arteries that comes out of the top of the heart. The arteries that comes out of the top of the heart. One is the outer, going to the rest of the body. The other one is called the pulmonary artery that is going to the lungs. The semilunar valves, they are found in the blood arteries. They are found in the blood arteries that are leaving the heart. The semilunar valves are found in the blood arteries that are leaving the heart. One of it is going to the outer, the biggest arteries that connects to the rest of the body, that takes the oxygenated blood and pumps it from the heart, from the left ventricle, that is being pumped from the left ventricle, it takes it to the rest of the body and gives the oxygen and nutrients and the blood to every blood cells in our body. Okay, so that is one of it. The second of it is the one that goes to the other blood artery called the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery. Okay, so we're saying that the second types of valves that are found in the heart are the one that connects to the blood arteries in the heart. There are two blood arteries in the heart. One is the aorta, from the left ventricles joining the aorta, that's called the semilunar valve. There's also from the right ventricle, the deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle joining the pulmonary artery. Okay, also that valve is also called the semilunar valve. So these two valves, they are found in the heart. They are usual in the way that the only two arteries in the body that contains the valve. Okay, now the valves open when the ventricle contracts, so the blood squeezes itself past them to where it's supposed to go. Okay, so that's that for this section. Now let's take a look at another side of our today's lesson. Okay, so this we come to the end of our today's online class.